the beginning there was nothing, and then Browning said, "Let there be gas-operated firearms," and there were. So Browning created calibers in his own image, creating 45 ACP and 50 BMG, and he blessed them so. And Browning said, "Let there be slide-action pistols," and it was so. And on the seventh day, Browning saw all that he had made, and it was good. No, that's not quite right. When it comes to most inventors, be it firearms or really anything, it's not uncommon for them to have one really good idea that they keep incrementally tweaking and adapting until the end of time. Take the likes of Mikhail Kalashnikov, Ronnie Barrett, or Gaston Glock, all famous arms designers with a number of brilliant weapons to their names, but the majority of their most successful designs were based on the same basic operating mechanism. As great as their careers were, when it comes to firearms there is one man who stands above all the rest, a man who refused to stop cooking and whose weapons remain in use today nearly a century after his death. It's John Moses Browning, and if you haven't figured that out by now, I'm really not sure what to tell you. Browning is more than just a legend in firearm folklore. His contributions to the world of weapons through both his own company and in collaboration with the likes of Colt, FN Herstal, and Winchester were revolutionary, birthing some of the most significant ideas that have irreversibly changed the design of firearms and led to man-made horrors beyond comprehension. To put it in a way that I can understand, 20% of the standard weapons in Red Dead Redemption 2 were designed by Browning. So what did John Browning spawn to become the figure he's remembered as today? How did his guns change the course of firearm design? And why have the weapons he created become so revered? I usually put stuff like this near the end, but I'm going to put it here this time. There is a lot more to Browning's story than I can cover in a timely manner, so I implore you to check out the main source I used for this video, The Guns of John Moses Browning by Nathan Gorenstein, which is an unmatched biography of Browning that is so rich in detail and depth that I had to mention it. For the sake of not putting you through the 14-hour lecture I was considering making, I've cut out a lot of stuff to keep things moving, but if any part of this even remotely interests you, Gorenstein's book is more than worth seeking out. Thanks for hearing me out, and let's get back to it. Our story begins with a rabbit hole I'm neither bothered nor insane enough to go down. One of a staggering 22 children, John Moses Browning was born in 1855 to a Mormon family in Ogden, Utah. The son of a Mormon pioneer and a solid gunsmith in his own right, Browning would first dip his toes into the firearms business at the tender age of 6, when his father put him to work in the family gun store, teaching the young John how to repair and build guns, just as God intended. At the age of 10, John would put together his first weapon, a crude muzzle-loading shotgun built from a discarded musket barrel and some scrap wood and metal, which, to his credit, actually worked somehow. But his father was less than impressed, saying, and I quote, "You're going on 11, can't you make a better gun than that?" The young John must have taken this personally, because over the next 61 years he would make some of the most iconic weapons ever seen. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Browning would finish his rudimentary education by 1869, the same year the Transcontinental Railway would connect the once secluded Mormon settlement to the rest of the country, and spent much of his time repairing damaged firearms and hunting elk in the mountains. As you might expect, a life on the frontier repairing firearms runs quite dry after a few years, and given his father's financial troubles and a near-catastrophic fire at the family gun store, John and his brother Matt would purchase the store from their father in 1878, founding the John Moses and Matthew Sandifer Browning Company. Continuing to repair firearms, their father would remain a strong influence on the new company in its early years, especially during one particularly frustrating job for John, during which he shouted, "I can make a better gun than that myself," to which his father would respond, "I know you can, and I wish you'd get at it," prompting a 23-year-old John Moses Browning to design his first real firearm. By the time Browning was gearing up to produce his own firearms, a number of chemical, metallurgical, and manufacturing advances had radically modernized production capabilities. And in fact, had Browning been born just a decade or two earlier, his ideas would have been crippled by the unsophisticated methods of firearm production. Unfortunately, the dysentery-ridden West was still trailing behind the rest of the nation, and a lack of advanced production methods would still stunt his early ambitions, Browning shelving his idea for a repeater similar to the Winchester Model 1873 and instead pursuing a falling block single-shot rifle. This would turn out to be a very good idea, and his first true firearm, creatively named the Browning Model 1878 single-shot rifle, would improve on the falling block designs of yesteryear, and was sold out within a week, with John and his brothers establishing their own factory in 1880 to support their new business venture. By some bizarre stroke of luck, in 1883, the minor success story out of what was essentially a train stop in the middle of nowhere would fall into the lap of one Thomas Bennett, who just so happened to be the chief executive of the Winchester Arms Company. Given this happened some 150 years ago, stories vary on exactly how he came across Browning's rifle, but nonetheless, with Winchester in dire straits and desperately seeking imagination following several failed lever-action rifles, Bennett purchased the rights to the Model 1878 and invited a still largely unknown Browning to develop his repeater ideas in the industrial East. So, in 1884, John and Matt arrived in the then homeland of American firearms, glorious Connecticut, and again struck a deal with Bennett to produce John's repeater design, Bennett trading 10% of his company's yearly profit at the time for the rifle and the promise of more Browning-designed firearms, which, as you might have guessed, would end up being more than worth it. Within 5 years of discovering the Mormon manufacturers, Winchester had sold tens of thousands of Browning's designs. The Model 1878 sold as the Winchester Model 1885, and Browning's lever-action design being sold as the Winchester Model 1886. The rifles being significantly more refined offerings compared to their competitors, along with garnering praise from the most American of all time, and the man I named my cat after, Theodore Roosevelt. It would be within these years, though, that the first signs of tension between Browning and Winchester would arise. You see, both parties wanted to build a new shotgun, but disagreed over its action. Browning wanting to build a pump action, and Winchester wanting to stick to their, guns and go for another lever action. The relatively unknown Utan, being in little position to make demands, caved and produced the Winchester Model 1887, though as if an act of divine intervention, the new shotgun would barely be profitable for the entirety of its existence. Speaking of divine intervention, the Mormon Church would ship Browning off to Georgia to spread the good word for the next 2 years, but doing God's work didn't get in the way of Browning doing his own, designing a .22 caliber slide-action rifle that Winchester engineers said would never work. John took this personally, and somehow managed to put together a prototype which he would send to Winchester attached with a passive-aggressive message declaring, "You said it wouldn't work, but it seems to shoot pretty fair to me." The rifle built out of spite became the Winchester Model 1890, and while it's most historically significant for being the first repeating rifle to reliably use the popular .22 short cartridge, the Model 1890 is more famous for its copious use in the shooting galleries that littered the US until the end of the Second World War, the rifle remaining in production until 1858 without any major changes to the design. By 1889, Browning's tenure in the Peach State was over, and the 2 years his firearm fantasies had been flatlined would push John to cook even harder than he ever had before. While Browning had been on his holy hiatus, the French had done something good, for once. The introduction of smokeless powder completely changed the firearm game, increasing the velocity of bullets, but more importantly for our purposes, being much cleaner and thus allowing for firearms to utilize much more complex mechanisms. Another interesting quirk of smokeless powder was that 99% of the charge left the barrel as a gas, something Browning was keen to experiment with. Having been beaten by Hiram Maxim to build the first machine gun, John settled for the next best thing, the first gas-operated machine gun, which he began work on following a shooting competition upon his return to Utah. Within a single day of thinking of making such a weapon, Browning, with some help from his brothers, had a working prototype. It was nowhere near ready for any kind of serious production, but the prototype had merit, and with some 10 months of intermittent work, the gas-operated gun, weighing a fifth of Maxim's design, was ready to take on the world. The only problem that remained was finding someone who gave a shit. Winchester was out of the question immediately. If a pump-action shotgun had been too much of a deviation for them, a radically new and unproven machine gun was never going to be of interest. But luckily, Connecticut is about the size of a dumpster, and honestly just about as appealing. This meant that Colt, another of the several firearm companies based in the Constitution State, were well aware of Browning and his largely untapped potential. Colt would set up a demonstration of the new machine gun at their factory in Hartford, where it would be stress-tested over 1,800 rounds. 3 minutes and several hearing loss diagnoses later, the test would be over, Browning's new machine gun having fired all 1,800 rounds without a single malfunction. Now you might be thinking, wow, that's pretty impressive, John must have been pleased. And you'd be wrong, stupid. Despite the immense success of the test, Browning's machine gun got ridiculously hot. Like hot to the point that some of the lead in the bullets melted as it flew out of the barrel, which itself had turned from black to red and then to blue over the course of the test. Which funnily enough is what happens when you incorporate absolutely no cooling system into your machine gun. Like, I know this is a video glazing John Browning, but come on, why would you do that? So, for the first time, Browning refused to sell his firearm, opting instead to keep refining the design, and as the 1890s progressed, several Browning designs would prove pivotal in firearm history. By the time the 1890s rolled around, Winchester was purchasing so many Browning-designed firearms that the brothers joked that every trip they made east was a raid on the Winchester treasury, and honestly, they weren't far off. By 1900, Winchester would purchase 34 Browning-designed firearms it would never produce for $10,000 each in 1890s money, which honestly makes me think that the meetings between Bennett and Browning would just consist of John threatening Bennett with whatever gun he'd designed that week until he bought it. Back in reality, however, Winchester would pump out new Browning-designed firearms like crypto grifters pump out new rug pulls. The first was the Model 1892, a simpler, cheaper version of the Model 1886 designed to fire smaller ammunition, and a rifle Browning had promised to build in a month or Winchester could have it for free. Go figure, he received a $20,000 check a month later. The next was the Model 1893, the pump-action shotgun Browning had proposed to Bennett several years prior that would be greenlit following the success of the Spencer 1882, but this would feature a major design flaw, namely the gun occasionally painting the faces of its users with burning powder, and thus didn't sell too well. Following that disaster was the Model 1894, another lever-action repeater, this time to fully replace the Model 1886, and oh boy did it ever succeed at that, becoming possibly the most famous hunting rifle of all time and remaining in production to this very day. Unsatisfied with creating one of the best hunting rifles ever, Browning would then create the Model 1895, yet another lever-action rifle, this time with an internal magazine. The rifle finding itself fighting on the front lines of several conflicts around the globe for the next half-century, as well as being Browning's last lever-action design for Winchester. Think it ends there? No, you fool! Browning then finished the first gas-operated firearm, fixing the cooling issues at the cost of beefing up the weapon and selling the design to Colt, who would produce it as the Colt Browning M1895. Despite its importance in firearm lore, this was one of the least successful designs Browning ever made, being difficult to clear and prone to jamming in the hands of poorly trained troops, who just so happened to be its primary users. Oh, and remember that unsuccessful pump-action shotgun from like 2 minutes ago? Well, Winchester, notably without Browning's help, would revise the design and birth the legendary Model 1897, better known as the trench gun or the shotgun Germany cried war crime over in World War I, which utterly dominated the pump-action shotgun market. Like the barrel of his machine gun prototype, Browning was on fire, and his designs had made Winchester the nation's leading civilian arms manufacturer. But if you thought his 90s hot streak was impressive already, brace yourself for what comes next. If I asked you to think of a late 19th century handgun, the image that comes to most people's minds would probably be a revolver, something like the Colt Model 1873 or Model 1892. But by the time World War I happened in the early 20th century, handguns looked more like this. And if you ever wondered how this radical transition was made, look no further than John Moses Browning. As the 20th century loomed, gun makers the world over were trying to shrink Maxim's automatic operation down into smaller packages, but most successfully in handgun designs. The likes of the Salvatore Dormus, but more so the Borchardt C93, had proven that such a handgun could be made, and Browning was eager to throw his hat into the ring. Between 1894 and 1896, John would design several semi-automatic handguns based on his machine gun, while his brothers would put them together. But for the most part, a solution to the handgun question eluded him. That was until mid-1896, when he applied for a patent for something so new that Browning didn't even know how to describe it. Despite the early successes of handguns such as the aforementioned C93, or later Mauser C96 and Luger P08, the design Browning had created would completely revolutionize the handgun market. What he had created was a pistol with a slide, and in fact he'd patented multiple variations of this design, birthing the short recoil and blowback slide-action pistol operations seen in nearly every popular handgun available today. Browning would first take the designs to Colt, who essentially told him to fuck off, seeing it as a threat to their revolver offerings. But as luck would have it, a friend of Browning's at Colt knew just the place that would be interested, a struggling FN Herstal. At the time, FN were mainly producing licensed Mauser bolt actions, well, until Mauser got jealous of how many orders FN was receiving and revoked the license, sending the company into an economic freefall. With few other options and a promising new design from the American with a solid reputation, the Belgians purchased the rights to what they initially termed the Pistolet Browning, but we know it better as the FN Model 1900. The contract between Browning and FN stated that if they sold less than 5,000, the rights would revert back to Browning. By 1909, 500,000 Model 1900s had been sold, primarily in Europe, as the American market was still very much clinging onto their revolvers. Within a decade of selling the first modern pistol design, Colt had changed their minds, and Browning had produced several for both Colt and FN, including the aforementioned FN Model 1900, Colt Model 1900, Colt Model 1902, Colt Model 1903 Pocket Hammer and Pocket Hammerless, FN Model 1903, FN Model 1906, Colt Model 1908 Vest Pocket and Pocket Hammerless, and the FN Model 1910, though the FN models would be significantly more successful. For now though, let's put a pin in Browning's handgun ambitions and turn our attention back to Winchester. If your attention span allows you to recall Browning's relationship with Winchester, you may remember that things had gotten a little testy when John first proposed building a pump-action shotgun. Well, as the 20th century neared, this partnership again took a turn for the worst. In 1894, Browning, hot off of finishing his machine gun, unsurprisingly sought to build another brand new weapon, this time an auto-loading shotgun, showing his brothers a few designs, but by the next year, his attention had turned to the aforementioned semi-automatic pistols. On his return from his first trip to Belgium in 1897, Browning would revive his auto-loading shotgun, putting together a prototype utilizing a toggle link action similar to that of the Maxim machine gun and ball-shot C93, though unlike the unwieldy C93, it was shrunk down to be practical. Development would be put on hold while Browning again visited FN in 1898, but finally he would put the finishing touches on the shotgun upon his return, demonstrating it to FN and DWM's American sales manager in spring 1899 before taking it to Winchester, and it's at this point that the story takes a massive fucking detour. George Luger, creator of the Luger P08, took Browning to court over a patent dispute involving the toggle link action. Long story short, Luger's redesign of the C93 into the P08 used an incredibly similar action, resulting in an 8-year legal battle and one that Luger would eventually lose. His case was pretty shit, and that's honestly an understatement, but by the time the dispute was resolved, Browning had moved on and the toggle link shotgun was history. This was because the shotgun itself was also quite shit, some shells failing to eject, some failing to be ignited, and most worryingly, the gun randomly firing without anyone pulling the trigger. Instead, John would prototype a unique long recoil operated shotgun in 1899, revising it by 1901, and while it worked exceptionally well, its long recoil operation was an evolutionary dead end. And even worse, Winchester refused to put the weapon into production, not feeling a need to compete against the incredibly successful Model 1897 they were already selling. A falling out over a patent the next year would be the final straw for Browning, ending his 19-year relationship with Winchester by demanding a ridiculous amount of money they would never agree to for his new shotgun. Instead, he immediately took it to the Belgians, who would sell it as the Browning Automatic 5 in 1903, with Remington selling it in America under license starting in 1905 as the Remington Model 11, and both also producing Browning's similar long recoil auto-loading rifle design soon thereafter. Ultimately, the Auto 5 sold so well that the most definitive thing that can be said about the production numbers is that the Auto 5 is one of the most popular shotguns in existence, with millions sold officially and countless copies sold once the patent expired, the shotgun remaining in production until 1998. Meanwhile, the American military was slowly entering the 20th century and beginning the transition from revolvers to semi-automatic handguns, but that transition was about as smooth as a New York highway. Numerous tests of offerings from Luger and Colt had received a tidal wave of criticism surrounding reliability and ergonomic issues, and thus the military refused to adopt any semi-automatic handgun. Furthermore, the US, being the finicky fucks they often are, demanded their handguns be chambered in at least .45 caliber, following the incredibly American and highly contentious Thompson-Leggard ammunition tests, something neither the Luger or Colt designs were chambered in. Given how stubborn the US military is, the .45 caliber requirement was non-negotiable, prompting Browning, in partnership with Colt Union Metallic Cartridge and the Army, to spawn God's Caliber, .45 automatic Colt pistol, or .45 ACP, weighing twice as much and producing twice the power as the US's previously favored .38 caliber round. By 1907, a new round of tests was underway using the .45 ACP cartridge, this time featuring the new Browning-designed Colt Model 1905, a now highly sought-after .45 caliber Luger, and an offering from Savage Arms, though again, it was a shit show. The Army declaring that none of the pistols had reached such a stage of perfection as to justify its adoption. Luger would drop out soon thereafter, already at production capacity with orders for its 9mm offering from several European nations, leaving just the two Americans, Savage and Colt. Browning would redesign his pistol several times over the next few years, shortening the barrel, further angling the grip instead of it being almost vertical, and changing the barrel's internal mechanism to tilt the muzzle upwards as the slide moved back after firing, overall addressing the critiques from the military and simplifying the production for Colt. So, after 3 years of refinements and intermittent testing, the bell would ring for the next round in 1910, and it went even worse than it ever had before, forcing yet another redesign of the pistols. Finally, in 1911, the winner would be decided following a 6,000 round stress test, and if you've been here before, you already know where this is going. The Savage design failed some 30 times, while Browning's design had none, being adopted as the handgun that needs no introduction, the M1911. The rest, as they say, is history, though I will add that the tilting mechanism Browning added after the second test is now, along with the slide, a common sight on many modern handguns. So, where do you go after dominating much of the firearm market with several all-time great weapons? Well, the world had changed dramatically by the time the M1911 had entered service. The so-called beautiful era was going the way of the dinosaur as Europe's armies began gearing up for their next scheduled pissing contest, and Browning would soon capitalize on the new conflict. While seen today as the most powerful military in the world, the US's capabilities in the early 20th century were less than ideal. The lackluster response to the 1916 Pancho Villa raids demonstrating just how poorly equipped the US was, especially in terms of their machine guns. At the time, the US was fielding the French-made Benet Merci machine rifle, using it to provide both sustained suppressive fire from a stationary position as well as providing mobile supporting fire for advancing troops. And as with most firearms that try to be too many things, it was a disaster, being difficult and complex to make, overheating quickly, and being awkward to use. The First World War was in full swing by then, coincidentally kicked off by an assassination carried out with a Browning handgun, sparking the idea of so-called walking fire to break the trench stalemate, which is exactly what it sounds, guys walking across no man's land hosing the enemy down with automatic fire to breach their trenches. Refusing to stop cooking, Browning would produce designs to address both of these situations, the first being the water-cooled Model 1917. Browning had actually been working on this design since 1901, revising it by 1910 between his other projects, and having a working prototype by 1915, which he would again give to Colt for testing with the Army, and surprise surprise, it dominated the testing. The Model 1917 is often forgotten, however, as it was immediately overshadowed by Browning's next design, the BAR. The Browning automatic rifle was designed around 1912 and adopted to fit the walking fire concept, though it was capable of accurate fire from any position, also featuring a fire selector that allowed for both automatic and semi-automatic fire, along with using detachable box magazines, which were both relatively novel features at the time. In fact, so promising was the design that Browning was prohibited from patenting it until after the war by the US Army, as it would require him to disclose the specifics of his rifle. This, after several decades of creating firearms, would finally be the weapon to immortalize the Browning name, a public test of both new Browning machine guns in February 1918, earning John the very humble titles of the Edison of Guns and the Wizard of Firearms. All that remained was to test his guns in combat. As much as I want to make a snarky comment about the Americans refusing to get involved in World War I for 3 years, we're going to move past that and keep talking about Browning's guns. For their numerous military-adopted weapons, the Brownings had been diabolically robbed by the government, paid only $1.5 million of the $5 million they were owed, and receiving only $600,000 of that due to the wartime tax rate. But I'm gonna move on before I'm put on a list. While 1911s, M1917s, and M1897s were in use from the moment the Yanks landed in Europe, the BAR would have to wait for its time to fight, American military leadership fearing that the automatic rifle would be captured and used by the enemy, or even reverse-engineered. Nonetheless, throughout the, limited time the US was in the war, several legendary events would highlight the exceptional nature of Browning's firearms. BARs greatly helping the Americans clear German positions at Mount Faucon, M1917s proving reliable suppressive weapons in the trenches near Verdun, M1897 scaring the Germans so much they labeled it a war crime, and of course, who can forget the iconic tale of Alvin York, who killed several enemies with his 1911 and used it to take 132 Germans prisoner. For Browning, though, the war itself was of little importance to him. By the time the armistice was signed, he had been completely consumed by his work. So much so that his family found him distant even when they managed to drag him kicking and screaming out of his workshop. He felt that, even with his great successes, he had wasted his early years, and this would drive him to literally work himself to death. The last decade of Browning's life was marred by great success and great tragedy, continuing to cook even when it looked like the kitchen was about to burn down. But if you thought that being well into his 60s would slow Browning down, you clearly haven't been paying attention. Within months of war being ended for good, Browning had improved on his water-cooled M1917 machine gun with the venerable air-cooled M1919, which became one of the go-to machine guns strapped to every American vehicle possible for decades, though he was already working on the weapon that would largely replace it. With the advent of the metal shitboxes known as tanks in 1915, the Germans had developed the first anti-materiel round, the 13.2mm Tough, fired from a bone-rattling single-shot rifle, and the Americans wanted their own anti-materiel weapon in the form of a machine gun, which would have to withstand 5 times the energy of the standard 30 caliber round the US fielded. Browning was up to the task, developing the 50 BMG round and having a working prototype a month before the war had even ended, though it was far from perfect. A lack of need in the post-war world and frequent trips between Ogden, Hartford, and Liege would slow down the development of the weapon, but soon the M1921 Browning machine gun would emerge, adopted in very small numbers and still needing major improvements. We'll pick up the M1921 later, but for now let's turn our attention back to Belgium. As you might expect, being invaded took a toll on FN's business, and Browning would try to help the manufacturer get back on its feet. His first 2 attempts would both be about as useful as the cope cages on Russian tanks, one being a 22 caliber pump-action rifle known as the FN Trombone, which had several parts prone to just self-destructing, and then an over-under shotgun known as the FN Superposed, which, while it was a solid design, was overly complex for the war-torn company who needed something cheap and easy to make, so they told him to fuck off. Okay, well, that's not quite accurate. Instead, they would ask Browning to design a new modern handgun with double the magazine capacity of previous models. Browning was skeptical of the reliability of a higher capacity handgun magazine, but after Diudon Save proved a double-stacked magazine could work well in a modified FN M1903, John got to work. By now, you might be wondering what that great tragedy I mentioned a moment ago was, and it's here that it struck. Both John and Matt's sons would be arrested for murder in 1923, having shot the husband of John's daughter Elsie in self-defense at the height of a messy divorce, and while both men would be found not guilty, the whole shitshow that unfolded would tarnish the Browning name, but even more tragically, may have caused the heart attack that killed Matthew Browning during the trial. These events would drive John even deeper into his work, patenting the Browning High Power, an updated superposed, an improved 50 cal machine gun, a BAR revision, a 37mm autocannon, and even an early assault rifle that has been lost to history among the 19 patents he filed between 1923 and 1925. The indomitable Browning would continue his frenetic pace, and while working on the Browning High Power in 1926, he would suddenly die of heart failure in his son Val's office at the age of 71. Even though his body had failed, somehow he stayed cooking, his high-power pistol being finished by the aforementioned Diudon Save, which would popularize the double-stacked magazine design and become one of the most successful pistols in history, and the M1921 50 cal machine gun ultimately being developed into the legendary M2 Browning, a machine gun that remains in use to this day with no sign of being replaced anytime soon. Finally, his superposed shotgun would be finished by his son Val, and his 37mm autocannon would also be completed, though neither would reach the success of his previous designs. The world had lost its most prolific arms designer, but the legacy Browning left continues to live on a century after his death. How do you quantify a life like that of John Moses Browning? In all honesty, his contributions to the world go beyond anything words can fully encapsulate, but I'll give it my best shot. Browning is credited with the design of over 120 weapons and ammunition, selling literally countless amounts of them both before and after his death. Across all the weapons John built, he changed the course of firearm history several times, but if you want tangible evidence of the impact Browning has had on modern firearms, you need only look at the guns we have today. For anyone looking to buy a handgun, a shotgun, a lever-action rifle, or assault rifle, the best designs available were either made by Browning himself or developed from his ideas, establishing many of the common operating mechanisms and design features on most modern firearms. For militaries looking to purchase machine guns, the M2 remains a staple of armed forces the world over, and FN's incredibly popular mag is a modern development of the M1918 BAR's operating mechanism. His designs and those based on them have dominated the firearm market for over a century, the likes of the M1911, M1897, M1894, High Power, and Auto 5 still being highly popular to this day. As much as Browning's designs have become famous for their military use and wrought havoc throughout the world, John's pursuit of perfection in firearms was as much about ending war as it was about advancing our ability to wage it, viewing it as a patriotic duty to invent and the perfection of firearms as the ultimate end of warfare itself. Simply put, if there were going to be wars, there would need to be guns, and Browning set out to build the best. Look at any conflict over the last century, and somewhere in all of them, you will find soldiers carrying Browning-designed firearms. Undoubtedly, Browning changed the landscape of modern firearms, helping cement four of the biggest names we associate with the industry today: Winchester, Colt, FN Hostal, as well as Browning's own name, along with revolutionizing the designs of nearly every type of firearm. With everything he achieved in his 71 years of life and the lasting legacy of his inventions, I can confidently say there never has been nor will be another like the legendary genius of John Moses Browning. As I said in the intro, there is much more to Browning's story than what I've covered here, and if you're interested in learning more, the sources I've used are linked below. But I just wanted to say thank you for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this dive into the many firearms of John Browning, and I'd love to hear which of his weapons you like the most or think is the most historically significant. A video on the bar will be coming next, and the vote for the next firearm is live in the community tab. That's all I've got for now. Thank you again, and I'll see you all in the next one.